am your reflection. I fiend for your correction. The cross brought the connection, and through Jesus is perfection. Life done hit me crazy, been more stressed than ever. Living like whatever.
Doing it,
through the rain,
yes.
I feel you drawing closer. Lord, make me better. Take me, shape me, use me. I am yours. Take me, break me for the glory of the Lord. Okay, not only does he hold me when I'm down and feel I'm folding, he my coach when I'm the goalie. Never lonely, got that hope in he who holy, holy, holy. Keep that rugged cross all on me. Need that spirit to control me. Seek that word to come and mold me, yeah. It's like I can feel the blessings coming my way. Yeah. It's like I can feel the blessings coming my way.
I know that we all gonna be alright. We gon' make it through if it takes us all night. No matter what the odds may bring our way, I can see the blessings coming our way, yeah. Blessings on blessings, yeah. I can see the blessings coming our way, our way, our way. Blessings on blessings, yeah. I can see the blessings coming our way, yeah.
Nothing stopping me. No physical presence that I can't see. Oh, there's nothing in my way. 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 Would you hold me if I told you we can just run away? So come, my darling, let me help you. We can follow the sun and leave the rain for somebody else. Let's help ourselves, leave our troubles on the shelf. Don't you worry, we're gonna find all we need in our sunset paradise. All the sidewalks and the highways, they will turn into somebody else to help themselves, leave their troubles on the shelf. So don't you worry, we're gonna find all we need in our sunset paradise. Leave it all for somebody else to help themselves, leave their troubles upon the shelf. And don't you worry, we're gonna find all we need in our sunset paradise.
How are you? Yeah, Kayla did not help. We canceled out yesterday, but so just got in.
Ouais, super, si tu peux, génial, super, merci. Merci, merci. Merci. Okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our conference on urban fragility and the future of international development. My name is Mounia Tagma. I am a housing policy and housing finance expert. My work focuses on systemic change to improve access to decent and affordable housing, mainly in Africa and the Middle East. I will be walking you through the different sessions today, which I hope will be, and I am sure will be insightful and thought-provoking. For decades, cities across the global south have grappled with uncontrolled urbanization. Climate change and its consequences, economic shocks, and conflicts have exacerbated the fragility of many cities. These challenges call for a fundamental rethinking of the international community's approach to supporting vulnerable cities, especially at a time when international aid is questioned. Over 1 billion people live in informal settlements. Some of these people have been forcibly displaced. 1.5% of the global population now is forcibly displaced. That's twice the percentage of the population of 10 years ago. These pressures destabilize locally, but they also destabilize beyond borders. Today's conference brings together policymakers, civil society leaders, international development agencies, and the private sector to explore together how strategic investments in fragile urban contexts can drive long-term development and strengthen local, regional, and global stability. For our opening remarks today, I have the honor to welcome Her Excellence Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa. Ms. Espinosa is the president of Cities Alliance. She's also the former president of the United Nations General Assembly. Maria Fernanda Espinosa is the first woman from Latin America and the Caribbean to be president of the United Nations General Assembly. That was from 2018 to 2019. As an academic, a diplomat, a poet, a linguist, and a politician, she has served as Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Defense, and she is a recognized authority on global governance, climate change, and gender equality. Currently, as Executive Director of Global Women Leaders for Change and Inclusion, Ms. Espinosa also serves as a member of leading international organizations, amongst which the International Crisis Group, the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, Women in Global Health, and the Economic Commission of the Economics of Water. In May 2024, Ms. Espinosa was elected President of the Cities Alliance Assembly. Ms. Espinosa, thank you for your welcoming remarks. Round of applause for her.
Well, good morning, and thank you for this very extensive introduction, and apologies for that, but thank you. And I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning. Allow me to first thank the organizers of this convening, Habitat for Humanity International, Cities Alliance, the United Nations Regional Information Center for Western Europe. So thank you for bringing us together. It is a true pleasure to be here with you this morning. I would start by saying that many multilateral organizations, governments, development actors are already addressing the issue of fragility. They are actively considering and working on solutions to fragility. Our purpose today is precisely to add the urban dimension to the conversation. For the first time in history, as you very well mentioned, 57% of the global population, over 4 billion people, live in cities. And by 2050, we expect to have 70% of the global population just living in urban areas. And cities account for 2/3 of the global economy. They are a big, they are the space where economy happens. And they serve as hubs for jobs, for innovation, for social mobility. And yet, cities are also home to some of the world's most vulnerable populations. Most of today's crises, from conflict to climate shocks, poverty, inequalities, are playing out in cities in the world of today. Fragile urban settings are compounded with shortage of basic services, unsafe environments, and this, of course, fuels instability that can have far-reaching consequences. We know that we are interconnected, and sometimes these consequences go even beyond national borders. This makes urban fragility one of the most pressing challenges of our time. So why is that we're gathering here today? This event, it's in a way a call to action, to transform the way we approach fragile urban areas, not as problems to be contained, but as critical investment opportunities for long-term development, well-being, safety, and stability. Investing in infrastructure, in governance, and essential services is therefore not just about improving the living conditions of the people out there. It is about strengthening social cohesion, boosting resilience, and building global stability. So urban fragility presents a multidimensional challenge with, as mentioned, intersecting crises intensifying its impact in these settings. Many of the countries, like the one I come from, Ecuador, many middle and low-income countries are facing shrinking fiscal space, shrinking policy space, mounting debt, and limited capacity to invest in essential services, in infrastructure, in long-term resilience. And I think that we all know what the global landscape looks like, and these are not good news, unfortunately. Wars, political instability, violence have forced millions into fragile urban areas. Climate change has also multiplied these challenges, with 1.4 billion people living in cities highly exposed to climate risks, including extreme heat, floods, and rising sea levels, threatening livelihoods and infrastructure. This is why we seriously need to address urban fragility in a systemic, interconnected perspective. However, recent developments have led to the suspension of some of the international aid in many regions of the world. That was also mentioned at the beginning, and this has put critical programs at risk and deepening vulnerabilities. ODA is declining, we all know that. In 2024, ODA decreased by 2%, and when we say 2%, it looks like a small number, but this means $4 billion less, affecting over 70 countries and nearly 3 billion people. The estimated 5 trillion per year needed, for example, to finance climate-resilient urban infrastructure is far from being met. The UN tells us that between 2021 and 2022, cities secured only 831 billion per year for climate action, leaving, of course, a massive funding gap. Meanwhile, the geopolitical tensions, the polarization, the weakening of the multilateral architecture are making cooperation more and more difficult. In spite of that, and in spite of the challenges that we are facing, I think that we should look at cities not just as spaces where crisis, where we can see only crisis. They are also engines of change capable of driving inclusive and sustainable development. Building resilience requires a people-centered approach, one that prioritizes rights, environmental sustainability, and equitable urban growth. This is the foundation of the work of the Cities Alliance, ensuring that urban development puts care at the forefront. So I think that we cannot afford to see fragile cities as afterthoughts. Instead, we must recognize them as critical spaces for sustainable development, for the building of stability, of social cohesion, of security, and well-being. I invite you then to engage, to think boldly and creatively on the policy responses, the investment, innovative mechanisms, and explore ways to mobilize collective action to create resilient, inclusive, and thriving cities. Otherwise, the cost of inaction will be extremely high. So I really look forward to listen and learn from all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Espinosa. Indeed, we have so many challenges in cities, and yet, when our livelihoods are threatened in rural areas, the first places we run to are urban settings. Now, let me welcome Ms. Erika Gerretsen for our keynote address. Ms. Gerretsen is the Director of Directorate General of International Partnerships at the European Commission. She's a French and Dutch national, and her work focuses on human development, migration, governance, and peace. That's what she overlooks at the European Commission. Since 1995, she has worked at the European Commission in various roles, focusing on external relations. Her career also includes postings in the EU delegations in Slovenia and Benin. In 2003, Ms. Gerretsen joined the Directorate General for International Development Cooperation, DevCo, where she specialized in African affairs. She has worked since then in different roles within DevCo before joining the Directorate General for International Partnerships. Ms. Gerretsen holds a master's in business administration from the University of Paris-Dauphine and a master's of urban planning and local administration from Sciences Po Paris. Welcome, Ms. Gerretsen, and thank you for delivering our keynote address. Thank you.
Good morning to you all. Yes, the secret has been given, and I am an urban planner by training, so I'm very happy to be with you this morning, and really delighted to have received the invitation to provide this keynote address to you all. Madam President, esteemed colleagues, dear friends. Indeed, a lot of what I will say will resonate a lot with what you've been saying, Madame Espinosa. I think that the situation in the cities and the fragility around urban areas is acute now and is only going to become more acute as we move on and as the situation evolves. Indeed, 7 out of 10 people now will live in urban areas by 2050. At the same time, fragility, conflict are increasing on a global scale. Many countries are confronting the prospect of becoming more fragile, both due to the internal developments, instability, but also regional spillover effects of crisis in the surrounding areas. The root causes of fragility, as we all know, is also very much multifaceted, multi-layered, and all those dimensions are interconnected. And this is why this fragility aspect is a very complex, has a very complex dimensions, bringing together the political dimension, the economic dimension, social dimension, insecurity, violence, environmental degradation, and climate change impacts, as well as social inequalities. So all these dimensions need to be brought together in comprehensive responses and a comprehensive understanding of the root causes if we want to be able to provide a satisfactory response to the situation. One of the significant consequences of fragility is that it indeed leads to a rise in migration and forced displacement. And many rural areas in fragile countries lack job opportunities, leading to poverty, the desire to seek better prospects in cities. They often have limited access to basic services like healthcare, education, sanitation, prompting people to move to cities where these services and opportunities are potentially more readily available. Natural disasters, deforestation, land degradation can make rural areas less habitable, forcing people to migrate to cities. Adding to that, in some cases, conflict, violence, or insecurity in rural areas can further drive people to seek also refuge into the cities. Forced displacement heightens vulnerabilities of urban areas, putting pressure on hosting communities and exacerbating existing challenges. For those who cross a border, the final destination is often a refugee camp or a settlement. Like fragility in general, urban fragility is an increasing challenge across many regions of our world, particularly in what we call the global south. If left unaddressed, the pressure on urban areas threatens to destabilize local economies and communities. I would just like to cite a few figures just to illustrate what I'm saying. Over 1.1 billion people currently live in informal settlements, many of whom have been displaced due to conflict and climate change-induced disasters. It is estimated globally that more than 60% of all refugees and 80% of all IDPs are living in urban areas. According to the World Bank, 56% of the world's population, that is 4.4 billion inhabitants, live in cities. The populations of African cities are expected to grow by more than 900 million by 2050. As urban population growth accelerates in many regions, there is an emerging consensus that conflict, natural disasters, and displacement are increasingly also affecting urban centers, threatening broader national recovery and development. Addressing urban fragility is therefore crucial, because cities play a critical role in the development trajectories of fragile and conflict-affected states. Metropolitan areas, with their concentration of people, industry, and services, are important engines of economic growth and productivity in developing countries. Data suggests that cities are best placed to move from fragility to resilience by adopting the right policies, attracting investment to high-risk priority areas, providing meaningful opportunities for young people, and engaging in careful disaster planning. However, there is a data problem as well, because despite these high numbers that I've just cited, displaced people are actually often not formally counted as urban inhabitants in the censuses that are provided. And this leaves municipalities who host those displaced people without additional government funding to account for the increased demand on basic services, infrastructure, and housing that the influx of displaced people has created. So this was the picture that I wanted to state before entering into what our approach as EU is to fragility. Indeed, our approach recognizes the complexity and the diversity of the state of fragility. That is why we believe that a comprehensive, context-specific, and I really want to insist on the context-specific dimension, is essential in addressing it. We are also committed to applying, wherever possible, the humanitarian development and peace nexus, together with our colleagues from DG ECHO, the Humanitarian Office, as well as the External Action Service, ensuring that we address immediate needs while fostering long-term stability and resilience. Our approach is built on a context analysis, allowing us to tailor our interventions to the specific challenges at local level. We believe in working through partnerships and looking for the most effective alliances with partner countries at central but also at local level. The EU recognizes that in fragile states, local authorities play a crucial role in ensuring basic service delivery, social cohesion, and crisis response. Partnering with local authorities can directly impact the well-being of populations by improving access to water, sanitation, mobility, healthcare, housing, and emergency response, especially in crisis situations. To enhance urban resilience, we should focus on direct funding mechanisms for local authorities, fostering multi-stakeholder partnerships with civil society, and leveraging decentralized cooperation through a Team Europe approach, which brings with it the wealth of variety of European experience and expertise in terms of urban development. These efforts help strengthen local governance and promote inclusive policy dialogue as well as local democracy. Understanding and supporting locally driven resilience mechanisms is also key to addressing urban fragility. The EU is committed to investing in indigenous knowledge, including documenting local peace and conflict resolution mechanisms as part of a broader strategy to reinforce local-rooted democratic models and sustainable governance structures. Looking beyond the EU, partnerships with multilateral actors, the UN agencies, of course, and multilateral development banks are also part of our approach. They can be allies in co-financing crucial infrastructure projects, facilitating access to essential services, and supporting sustainable economic growth in vulnerable areas. The Global Gateway strategy, which the EU is rolling out, is also part of this response to urban fragility. Through the Global Gateway rollout, we can bolster connectivity and digital infrastructure, promote renewable energy solutions, and enhance health and education systems across fragile urban settings, for example. We also look for more sustainable and inclusive approach to settlements of refugee camps in urban areas, with a focus on integrating all the populations in the local economy and involving them in planning of municipal services across various sectors, from education, healthcare, and social planning. So I really want to emphasize that while we are working on the Global Gateway strategy, the Global Gateway strategy also applies to fragile countries. Actually, many of the Global Gateway initiatives and flagships are being implemented in fragile and conflict-affected states, where we can engage. And in this dimension, it's really crucial for me to engage with local authorities and cities. Especially in those contexts. This is why we have the Global Gateway CSO and local authorities platform that has been established to exactly create this platform of dialogue with local authorities and civil society actors to ensure that the Global Gateway strategy really responds to the needs where the projects are being rolled out. Coming now to the specific challenges in urban settings and giving more concrete examples of EU action. The fragile urban settings face the specific challenges. I've been quite eloquent about this already. Rapid pace of urbanization in conflict-affected areas exacerbates the vulnerabilities, perpetuating cycles of poverty and inequality. And in these environments, the lack of adequate housing, essential services, and economic opportunities places a disproportionate burden on already very marginalized and vulnerable populations. So our interventions must address these interconnected challenges in building resilience, inclusive cities that can withstand this pressure that is only but growing. So I will just share a few examples of the support that we are currently contributing to. Again, always in partnership with others. So one example in Latin America with UN Habitat and the UNHCR as well as IOM, we have helped local authorities to integrate Venezuelan refugees and migrants into host cities and communities. There has been 6 pilot cities and 5 countries across Latin America and the Caribbean were involved in this project. It developed innovative participatory planning strategies for local authorities to integrate refugees and migrants in urban communities in the medium to long term, and shows that migrants and refugees can actually make a real contribution to the socioeconomic and cultural diversity in their host cities. This is a very nice, good project that I've been also listening to the feedback from the project implementers, and I must say this is very granular. It really requires a sort of a very detailed analysis of which populations, which areas of the city, etc. But it really brings excellent, it has been bringing excellent results. A second example, in the Horn of Africa, the EU created its first ad hoc urban displacement program through the EU Trust Fund for Africa. This was the comprehensive refugee response framework, inclusive urban development and mobility. This was a project which was implemented between 2019 and 2023. In Ethiopia and Uganda. And it addressed for example, water supply to health centers and hospitals in the town of Asosa, and improved access to and the quality of education for health services, and created beneficial livelihood as well for and employment opportunities for the youth and women. And following the successful pilot, we selected Cities Alliance to implement the first NDICI-funded regional urban displacement intervention in sub-Saharan Africa. That's the project called the Support to Urban Integrated Displacement Affected Communities. It has a funny acronym. I don't know how you pronounce it, SWIDAC. It's been signed recently in June 2024. It expands the EU investment in the Horn of Africa's secondary cities from 8 million to 30 million, and extends support to Sudan, Somalia, as well as the DRC. And we also work with others to shape the responses and frameworks At the Global Refugee Forum in December 2023, the EU pledged a total of 34.7 million towards the multi-stakeholder pledge, which was the call for action and solidarity in secondary cities and local and regional governments. And this includes as well the SWEDAC program. The EU has partnered with the UN Habitat in the development of an urban recovery framework, for example, as well, which is a key tool to improve response in urban, in crisis area, in urban regions, in urban areas. And finally, very important as well, the EU places the protection needs of displaced people at the center of its development policy, providing political and financial support, including to promote social cohesion between the host communities and the refugees. Let me conclude now. I have been a little bit long, but in closing, I just want to confirm, reconfirm, and reaffirm the need to remain engaged, all collectively. Again, it's not something that one actor can do together. I think partnership in all this is absolutely essential. We need to remain engaged in fostering resilience in vulnerable settings, in a conflict-sensitive manner, and with special attention to the needs of the most vulnerable, having strategic investments, comprehensive frameworks, and strong analytical grid. The EU will be working, some of you may know, together again with DG-INTPA and the EAS on the new approach to fragility. This is a mandate that has been given to Commissioner Labib for humanitarian aid, as well as Commissioner Sikela for international partnerships. So I think it will be important in the context of this work that we place and we give a particular space for the discussion around local democracy and urban areas and what the impact of conflicts and instability is having on urban areas, and therefore the need to invest specifically at that level. On this, thanks a lot for your attention. Sorry if I've been a bit long, and looking forward to the results of your conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gerretsen. You haven't been long at all, and thank you for giving us a glimpse of what organizations can do on so many levels to improve resilience of cities in the Global South. The next session is our first panel discussion. It will explore the connections between international development investments, social cohesion, and global stability. This session will be moderated by Dora Meredith, who is the director of ODI Europe, Overseas Development Institute Europe. Welcome, Dora.
Hello, is that working? No? Give it one moment. Hello? Excellent. Wonderful. I think I'd like to start by saying, as we've heard this morning, cities are hubs of opportunity. Urban centres generate over 80% of global GDP and serve as incubators for innovation, from climate resilience, strategies to inclusive governance models. And if managed well, urban areas have the potential to drive global progress on the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, while urbanisation brings opportunities, it also presents, as we've heard this morning, significant challenges. Nearly 1 billion people currently live in informal settlements or slums. And by 2030, over 70% of urban areas will face high exposure to climate-related disasters, such as flooding, extreme heat, disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities. We must be clear, therefore, that cities, not just countries, are increasingly facing multidimensional stresses, climate change, rapid population growth, and the strain of infrastructure unable to keep pace with demand. We've seen this winter, for example, in Los Angeles, how vulnerable urban areas are and how devastating the impact can be. We're also seeing the emergence of new forms of violence convulsing in urban areas. The violence in Port-au-Prince, often described as gang violence, is akin to the wars of the 1990s in West Africa, with the complete destruction of police posts, looting down to the copper from electricity cables, and a complete breakdown of security assistance models. Indeed, cities have become arenas where often state authority is weak, and where governance is challenged, and where non-state actors establish control. ODI Global, and here with ODI Europe, is increasingly engaging in the space of urban fragility, in discussions with UN Habitat, as well as other partners, and is committed to complementing the work of humanitarians who for several years have identified that the future is urban. While this work is nascent, we look at the future of international development quite clear that it is imperative that we focus on solutions tailored to urban context. This means fostering partnerships between local governments, communities, and international actors, investing in resilient infrastructure and addressing the root causes of fragility: inequality, governance deficits, and environmental risks. So, I hope that today we can use today's discussions to explore how we can move beyond responding to crises and instead build urban systems that are inclusive, sustainable, and prepared for the challenges that lie ahead. So I should introduce myself. My name is Dora Meredith, and I'm the director of ODI Europe. We're a global affairs think tank with offices in Brussels, London, and DC. And I'm really delighted to have been asked to moderate such a fantastic panel today. So let me introduce them. First of all, we have John van Wetter, who is the managing director of Enabel, the development agency of the Belgian federal government. John, would you like to come and join me? Thank you. We have Jonathan Reckford, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Habitat for Humanity, which is an NGO which seeks to build affordable housing. Hello, Jonathan. We have Greg Monroe, who is the Director from Cities Alliance, the global partnership fighting urban poverty and promoting the role of cities. Hello, Greg. And finally, we have Julia Iverson, I hope I've pronounced this right, Julia, who is Director of Democracy and Digital Governance and the Urban Development Centre at the German cooperation agency, GIZ. So really a stellar panel with me here. Great. So I think we're going to have quite a relaxed and informal discussion today. So I hope we can start by jumping straight into it. Julia, could you kick us off by saying, from your perspective, why is it important for donors to consider the urban agenda as part of the fragility agenda? Thank you.
So, yes, thank you very much, Dora, for the opening remarks, and also to Ms. Espinosa and Ms. Gerretsen for this introduction. So it's quite hard to answer the question without repeating everything you already said, but I will do my very best. Let me start by saying that fragility for us as GIZ is a very defining characteristic of our work. So 2/3 of our partner countries are considered fragile, and we're engaging in more or less 120 partner countries worldwide, and this also means that our urban development programs have to deal with very different settings of fragility, no? Ranging, let's say, from climate-induced risks in many countries of the world, or nearly all our partner countries, to war-related destruction in Ukraine, or to rapid expansion, urban expansion, especially in very fragile contexts. So we know that in many of the most fragile settings, the urban expansion is even quicker than in many other regions, or let's say climate-induced displacement in Bangladesh. So we have a very broad topic we're talking about now. And we also see that this fragility does not only impact local communities, but also regional and global stability in many cases. So we really need an intentional
and systemic approach to this question. So it was already mentioned how fragility has an urban dimension. I will not repeat this, and I very much agree that although the global urbanization trends may be further driving fragility, and we've heard that, integrated and sustainable development can also be part of the response, and we really need to look how this could look like. So addressing these challenges requires a very broad and context-specific approach, adapted to realities of each setting, and we really need to tailor urban development strategies to fragile settings, because it's a very huge difference if you're responding to acute crisis or if you want to build long-term resilience. And what we are also seeing is that the worldwide urbanization trend, and I'm very happy that we are having this discussion today, means that we need to see that, let's say, stability, peace, and security agendas increasingly overlap with urban agendas, and we really need to see how we can interlink this better. So for us, applying also the humanitarian development peace nexus allows for a more systemic and sustainable response, addressing also the root causes of fragility by building resilience in small areas. And I really also wanted to point out that in many also of our projects, we are very much concentrating also on small and medium-sized towns, because these are also very affected, and not only the metropolitan areas. And I think we will talk about investment, because this comes with some additional challenges. Merging urban development strategies with fragility response, I think it's essential. With that, we can strengthen local institutions, promote inclusive urbanization, build more resilient communities, and with that also help to prevent further and future crises. One point I would like to make is that also in politically estranged contexts, and we are facing this more and more, the focus on municipalities and on urban regions can also be a very good step to stay engaged in these kind of settings, because we are seeing that even in contexts like Mali or Chad, where it's getting hard and difficult to work with the national level, we can still see impacts and also structural changes at the local level. So for what is to come, and I think we'll also talk about EU policies, obviously we have to take into account that the domestic priorities will be more important also for our international agendas over the next years. And I'm very glad that we're seeing this commitment at EU level to really engage in fragility and all this what comes with that. And I really think that we also, from the urban fragility perspective, we need to implement more integrated and global solutions, and that the European Union and also Team Europe can deliver on this. And we will for sure discuss some of the examples. So I'm very much looking forward for the panel today.
Thank you so much, Julia. Jean, could we pick up there? Could you tell us a little bit about how you see urban fragility aligning with the strategic agenda and with the Global Gateway and Europe's priorities?
But first of all, thank you very much for this timely conference. So thank you to Habitat and to Cities Alliance for inviting me. I think first I would like to go to the title of your conference and the future of international development. We are in a very critical time, as you know, what we see in the US, but also in most of the European countries, where you see a decrease of ODA, but it's not only a decrease of ODA, it's a decrease of the public interest in international cooperation. And I think you frame it perfectly, Dora, in your introduction, because you said actually investing in stability is an investment that reduces the cost of later interventions. And indeed, it's the narrative that we try to do, at least here in Belgium, but also at the European level, to make the general public first, and then our politicians understand that investing in fragility or investing in city development or investing in international cooperation is reducing the cost for later. But unfortunately, the trend now is very short term. We see that we are decreasing our investments and we will pay the cost later. Even without looking at the current crisis, we should just look at the demography. The African continent will be 40% of the world population by the end of this century. It will more than triple. So even without climate change, even without conflict, even without coup d'etat, we know that there will be a pressure on cities, and there will be a pressure on developing social cohesion in every part of the world. It's a fact, and I think we should be bolder in the way we speak to the public about international cooperation, and not speaking anymore about solidarity or about the global south, but really about saying, guys, it's our common world, and if we don't act together on this, we will have a problem for later. So what do we do in Global Gateway and the EU? So thank you, Erika, for this introduction, and I agree with you. One of the criticisms sometimes that is brought to Global Gateway is that it's only focusing on more developed area, and it will only benefit those regions that already have. I don't believe into that, because indeed Global Gateway is covering fragile countries, and if you look at the strategic corridors strategies that are currently being developed, it's in a way helping landlocked countries to access to the sea, to the port, and so by developing those corridors, you help local development in cities and regions which are less developed because of the lack of access to natural resources. So I think within the strategic corridor strategies of the EU and Global Gateway, there is a good opportunity to develop secondary cities in between those main cities that are being targeted by that. And within more fragile context, if you look, as Erika mentioned, there are specific attention and specific strategies now being developed for fragile contexts like the Sahel. There are many interventions looking at internal displacements and secondary cities like Kaya City in Burkina Faso, for example, where we currently work, where you have 70% of the population which are displaced, and where we already provide local economic development. So I think it would be a mistake to say Global Gateway doesn't cover fragile countries. On the contrary, I think it's an opportunity. Now, what we need to do more, and that's what Enable typically does with our local approach. It's not only having, I would say, global strategies, but making sure that we can localize them, and as I said in my introduction, make people understand that that's developing a city in Burkina Faso or developing a city in Brussels. It's at the end of the day the same type of challenge, even if there are maybe more in one area than in another. But it's the same type of approaches as local participation, citizen engagement, listening to the needs of the people, understanding the long-term trends that will occur. And that's the only way I think we can secure funding for this kind of intervention if we make, as I said in the introduction, people here understand that it's also their problem. And so I believe next to the traditional international cooperation and donor-driven approaches, we should see more city-to-city alliances and more citizen involvement. And we see that in Belgium with involvement of communes. We have alliances of Belgian communes helping and twinning between Belgian cities and cities in Africa. And I think that's a good combination with what international development can do. I will stop here, but I can say more later.
Thank you so much, Jean. That was great. Greg, could I come to you next? As Jean was just saying, that the need for financing is often really great in urban areas, and infrastructure investment in particular. Concretely, could you tell us a little bit about where you see the opportunity for MDBs working on projects to address urban fragility?
Great, thanks. So infrastructure deficit in Africa, for example, I mean, there's numerous numbers are floated around. And I mean, I was just reading yesterday, I mean, just the trade infrastructure deficit, so roads, corridors, ports, is somewhere between $70 and $100 billion a year. And you're not going to talk about the economic growth of African countries and African regions without that investment. We also know that there's a fiscal borrowing space for Africa is just declining at a rapid rate. Increased debt burden for many of the countries so that they can't borrow, restrictive contract terms, lack of sophistication amongst the private sector in Africa, bureaucratic hurdles, sustainability challenges, there's numerous issues. So what do you do with the MDBs? I think the one is an awareness. And the world, and it was just been mentioned about the population growth in Africa, the world is Africanizing, it is urbanizing, it is informalizing, and it is increasingly becoming more fragile. And if we don't address that, then I don't know then we need to make sure the MDBs address that head on. The second is, so that's the awareness, the influence, and we can influence. So Cities Alliance in 2023, and led by Julian at the back, we helped the African Development Bank develop their urban strategy. And and the issues around poverty and urban poverty and fragility were in that strategy. The third is about reform. If we do not have development finance reform in 2025, then we may as well go home. Because the banks are not fit for purpose in the current climate. And we need reform, which is why the development finance reform is so high on the agenda for 2025. We also need to increase blended finance initiatives and the environment where this can happen. I mean, urban fragility is a multidimensional challenge, and therefore we've got to have a multidimensional response. And this coordinated collaborative response, when you look at some of the literature and some of the great things that are written, they talk about collaboration with governments and funders and private sectors and intermediary organizations, and they leave out the two most important sectors: the communities themselves and local government. Because there's no point dealing it at a national level if it doesn't reach people living in cities and communities.
Thank you very much, Greg. And finally, Jonathan, could you perhaps give us some examples from your experience of working with the private sector in these settings? So again, thinking about investment needs, are there examples of best practices that you could share with us from things that you've seen?
Thank you, and I want to build on what Greg just shared, which is first, there just isn't enough government money to create housing at the scale that we need without crowding in private capital. The private sector is going to represent the overwhelming majority of the financing. And so how do we actually create the environment to crowd in that capital? And it has to be a multi-sector solution. And I think we've heard that from all across. The government can create the enabling environment. And especially in the Global South, especially in these fragile environments, most of the housing is built incrementally at the family level, not by large companies. And so how can we create an ecosystem that actually works for that to happen? And if we think from an ecosystem approach, it starts first with land. And I can talk more about, so often the inability to have the legal right or at least secure tenure stops a family from investing, upgrading housing because you don't know that you can get the return on investment. And so land has been our longtime #1 advocacy effort. Many good examples, but with support of the British government over a long period of time, in many countries still, especially women and marginalized groups, don't have property rights. And in Bolivia, after a multi-year campaign, this very powerful group of Bolivian women not only got the rights to their own property, they got the federal law changed so that if a man owned land and wanted to register his land or his home and was married, it had to be joint titled. And to me, that's a great example of changing the enabling environment. Now, real success is when all those women actually get those assets, but that's the start. Maybe our best practical example is around housing finance, which is the next big barrier. So in general, if you're not in the top 5 to 10% of the population, there's no access to a formal bank loan for housing in all of these fragile contexts or informal settlements. So we started, almost 20 years ago with experiments to convince and train microfinance institutions to begin doing home improvement lending. And the thesis was they could only lend for small businesses because that would generate the income. We found through a series of tests that in fact repayment rates were as high or higher than the small business loans because there was so much demand. And we launched 12 years ago a wholesale fund, debt fund called Microbuild, where we raised a $100 million fund. We've now, over the last 12 years, loaned out $240 million in 32 countries to 62 microfinance institutions and trained them on how to start housing portfolios. The really exciting thing is that has directly helped 1 million people have access to home improvement loans. But even better, those microfinance institutions that have now been trained have put in $1.2 billion of their own capital. So we're starting to see scale, and we're raising a much larger fund now. And if you really think, where can you get a loan? There aren't a lot of opportunities for home improvement. And then you go to building materials. And we have a shelter tech program in each region where we've been working with private sector entrepreneurs to come up with better building products for very low income families to be able to do those home improvements. And then the last piece is, how do you actually do the consumer education? How do you hire a mason? How do you get the skilled trades? And we're still very early in that game, but we've been doing web-based entertainment, radio and television in Peru, Kenya, and the Philippines. And that turns out to be actually a very cost-effective way to bring information to families to be able to do it. So I want to give that picture because ultimately, I think if private sector can create that environment, the public sector can create the environment, civil society can bring the voice of the community, which is so needed, but we need the private sector to play at scale.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. And indeed, it's that creation of an ecosystem that we so want to enable. Julia, can I come back to you, perhaps, to touch on, the role of non-state actors further, or if you had anything from your experience?
Perhaps to add something to the MDB discussion, I very much agree with what was said. We're in regular exchange and collaborate closely in the field with MDBs. For example, we're running this so-called City Climate Finance Gap Fund together with World Bank and EIB. But we have some observations that perhaps also need to be discussed. So first of all, one of the big challenges is the ticket size, so the volume of infrastructure projects, especially in secondary cities that we're talking about now. And the ability how to really design these kind of projects with partners in these kind of cities. No, so I just wanted to say I think we really have to discuss. Obviously, I say that because I come from a technical cooperation agency, but we're really seeing that it's crucial and very important to really link this. And so I'm glad that also this multi-sectoral approach was mentioned. These investment strategies also to govern broader governance issues, state of law, land rights, etc., and also to link the investment part in a very intelligent way with the TA and with really enhancing the capacities of the cities themselves to go into project planning and to really engage with the banks, and also to have a very sensitive way at looking at the debt problematic that comes with it, and so on and so forth. So that's what I wanted to add to this discussion. Perhaps for the informal actors, and you also, it was also mentioned in the introductory word. So informal actors, and we know that play a very crucial role in urban governance structures, let's say, in partner countries. That's not only for the civil society, we could come to this later, but also other actors like important veto players, be it civic movements, but also organized crime and so on. No? And I think to deal with this situation, we really have to be very cautious to invest also in context and conflict analysis, to analyze how the local economies or the political economists work. And this is also a chance because it requires more information sharing also between us, let's say, as actors also within Team Europe, to really understand how the situation on the local level is and to take this into account. And we also see that cities or urban hubs in many of the contexts we are talking about are very attractive for these informal groups because they are hubs of transportation infrastructure, physical space, illicit goods, and so on and so forth. And this means that, let's say, even relatively remote spaces, let's say in West or East Africa and Latin America, can have a global influence because they are parts where also, let's say, transnational organized crimes are happening and so on. So I very much agree on the topic that was already mentioned. We really have to integrate the cities as players in this discussion, the mayors and the city networks, and better align these approaches of urban development also to approaches we have in illicit financial flows, combating transnational organized crime and so on, because this happens in cities.
Absolutely, and sort of creating a shared agenda that's shared across actors, I think, is really important. So thank you very much, Julia. Jean, can I come back to you? Any reflections on what's been said and perhaps also specifically on your experiences with working with civil society or different actors?
Yeah, thank you. A few reflections. I mean, on community engagement and working with civil society, my colleague Alexis we will speak later today on community engagement in Palestine, where we renovated public space using innovative approach in involving local communities. So I will not say, I will say it later. We have also good examples in Morocco, where we worked on citizen engagement in 12 cities, and in a context where citizen engagement is not always easy, but with also a lot of success. But I want to come back to, I think, what Jonathan said about public-private partnerships, and indeed, private money. It's not only private money; it's also the development bank money. And what we see and we observe is that most of the large or the traditional development finance institutions, so the African Development Bank and others, they have difficulties to find what they call bankable projects, so good projects, and they tend to limit the risk to finance projects that are already financed by another player, which is a pity, because at the end of the day, to reduce the risk, I'll say, the UK is already so I will also fund it. And ideally, we should spread the projects and ensure that the less usual suspect will have access to the funding. And that's typically where I see the role of an organization like Enable, because our strength is a very strong local network. It's not very known, but we have 2,000 staff in Africa. So although we're a small country, Belgium, we have an agency that has a lot of projects on the ground, and we can make the link between community-driven initiatives and large-scale initiatives. And next month, I will go to Abidjan, to the African Development Bank, to explain, and 2 months ago I was at the World Bank to do the same, to say, look, there is a lot of money, but the money doesn't reach, I would say, those the most in it. It does, but not sufficiently. And so there is a role, I think, for development agencies like us. Another thing we would like to do is to drive more local initiative. What you see in many of the contexts where we work is also a growing inequality within the country. And sometimes there is a lot of people with a lot of money that do not know what to do with their money because the local civil society is not developed enough, or they're afraid to invest their money in, and sometimes they would put their money in Dubai. And so how do you convince those people to reinvest in their own country on social urban projects? And the last point I wanted to make, which maybe has not been addressed yet, is all the creative industries and the role of culture in development. And I think that's something which is not sufficiently addressed. And I give a personal example because I lived in Dar es Salaam for 6 years. And it was at the time, so Dar es Salaam will be one of the largest cities in the world. It will be 10 million inhabitants very soon. And the cultural offer was relatively limited. And there were a few local initiatives taken that with little funding from the EU, managed to grow. There is, for those who know, Nafasi Art Space, for example, but it's not a lot of money in terms of investment, but it can make a huge difference in terms of social cohesion, local economic development, well-being of the families, and exchange between poorer and more well-off communities. So I think also it's not a sexy topic, cultural industries for traditional development topic agencies, and I think it's a pity. I say that because I see when I come to a new minister, I say, we will develop cultural activities. Really, this is not really a role, and why we should do that. But it's not a lot of money, but it can has a lot of impact.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Greg, can I come to you? Jean just mentioned social cohesion as being one of the key things to navigate. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience on social cohesion interlinked with the urban agenda, but also specifically in conflict-affected settings or reconstruction after war, for example? How can you build an integrated approach across communities?
Thanks. So one thing that Cities Alliance did in the past was do a lot of city development strategies, and saying you don't just build a city with bricks and mortar. You actually get all stakeholders in the city engaged, and how do you create an inclusive city? And we've done that in many cities. There seems to be an approach recently to war, and the first thing you do is you obliterate the city, and you bomb it. And you target the residential areas, and you target the citizens. And we're seeing that in conflict areas all over. So a nice example, one of the places where we did a city development strategy was Aleppo. Economic zones, markets, are really integrated, and it was a really successful city development strategy. If you look at Aleppo now on Google Earth, all the work that we did all those years ago is obliterated. It's gone. So, but that doesn't stop us trying to create inclusive, resilient cities. Now, in a conflict area, so we've been engaging together with civil society with female refugees from the Ukraine, and asking them, when we eventually do the reconstruction in the cities, how do you want the city to look? How did it not work for you? We also ask women that question in peaceful areas. So we've done it in Africa. And big surprise, because it's exactly the same answer you'd get if you asked women in Paris or London. How does a city not work for you? The first three priorities: security, 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 in all the cities. Then after that comes issues around opportunities for economic zones and getting women involved in the economy, and then social, and all those come afterwards. So we're also working in Haiti, which is another area, and we're working together with Habitat for Humanity. And one of the things we've learned working in places like Haiti and on the edges of Ukraine and Somalia and now also in Sudan is that our entire approach to programming and our entire approach to city development is through a conflict and fragility lens. So that all the staff are aware of what a conflict and fragility lens, because that's what's happening in these cities where we're working. The other thing that's also clear is we think about reconstruction and construction as these big projects, big roads and big bridges. Yeah, we need them. Never forget the small infrastructure. So we have as a philosophy of the way we work is the issue of community upgrading funds. So in Haiti, we actually ask the communities, what do you need? And what do they need? They need markets. They need their markets done so they can actually trade with each other and actually earn a livelihood. And those small infrastructure, they are driven by the community, they get owned by the community, they have skin in the game, they are sustainable, and importantly, they build trust. And they build trust, in Haiti we're working with local government, so they build trust between the community and local government. And if that's not one of the fundamental steps to addressing fragility, then it has to be. Building that trust has to be one of the fundamental steps.
Thank you very much. And I think maybe we'll come back to that if others also want to contribute to that, because I think it's a really important point. Just finally, could I just ask you, Jonathan, to tell us a little bit about your top policy priority in terms of improving development in urban fragile settings, perhaps building on some of the things we've heard?
Yeah, I particularly want to go right off that issue of small infrastructure, because I think sometimes it really, back to that idea of creating the enabling environment, and often we see all the problems, the statistics we've heard all morning in terms of the scale of the challenge, but you can also see these informal settlements as incredible economic engines and assets. And it's really, how do we unleash the opportunities and assets that are in? People are moving to the cities for economic opportunity. And one of the challenges often is they're creating a lot of economic value. The value is being extracted rather than reinvested very often. So how do you create the environment for that? And we did we launched about 18 months ago our second global campaign around the idea of home equals, specifically focused on informal settlements. And we launched with a report that looked at the economic opportunity for cities and countries if they were to invest in formalizing and realizing the economic potential of these settlements. And this was just a few facts. When at large scale, GDP and income per capita could increase by as much as 10.5% in some countries. Roughly 730,000 lives would be saved. One of the things I often see is that there's a mismatch. We spend a lot of money on medical, but we don't treat the underlying issue. And if you don't have safe, healthy homes, we won't get the medical impacts we want. And as many as 41.6 million additional children will be educated in school. So if you think about housing in so many ways is really that prerequisite or foundation for the broader ecosystem and the economic opportunity. And of course, upgrading housing creates an enormous amount of work and jobs as well. So it is, we would see, I think the number one policy would be actually to shift resources into local infrastructure and creating the environments for housing, and then targeting subsidy where it's most needed to the most vulnerable, and then let the market actually create the housing.
Thank you very much. Julia, would you like to add?
I wanted to add something from our experience. So what we've done a lot, for example, in Iraq, but also Chad, Mali, and so on, is really to try to combine our urban approaches with what we're doing in transitional aid in order to really combine, let's say, short-term impacts that the community is feeling right away with the more structural approaches that we're coming with, and then to really try to have a more integrated view on what is needed in infrastructure topics, but also in community involvement in decision making and in the planning processes for this more, let's say, mid and long-term direction. And that has been quite successful. It also leads to rebuild legitimacy on the ground, which I think it's a very important point for social cohesion, that we're also seeing these political dimensions in situations where, let's say, trust in state and service delivery and so on is completely distracted. And we've seen that this mixture also of, let's say, infrastructure, but also generating economic possibilities, and at the same time making sure that we have community-led approaches can be quite successful still, even in very fragile contexts. And I think this interlinkage, let's say, and this very intentional interlinkage between the transitional part and the development part, let's say, in this can't be pointed out too much.
Thank you so much, Julia. Absolutely. Jean, would you like to add something particularly about the actors or the top policy priorities?
Yeah, I wanted to add something that I said in the beginning. So we are challenged as international development community, and we need to reimagine what will be our role in the future. And here I see an opportunity in leapfrogging, because all the challenges we face, it's an opportunity to innovate, and maybe the innovation debate has not been put on the table. But if you look at Ukraine or Gaza, there will be huge reconstruction needed, and of course you could reconstruct quickly with the same methods you used in the past, but that would be wrong. And what we try to do at Enable is to bring various kind of stakeholders together here in Belgium, but also internationally, in terms of urban planning, materials, engineering, try to do things that we haven't done here before or that hasn't been done somewhere else. And that's also a way, if you do it better, and the methodologies can be also applied here, that can also help to attract public attention and get the support of the public we need for what we do, because people will realize that they also have local benefits. And I think that some people still see international development as something far away from them, and we need to bring it back here.
I couldn't agree more. Yes. Jonathan, could I come to you in terms of, you've talked about your top policy priorities. Just over the next year or so, are there other things on your agenda in terms of, in terms of this agenda?
Yeah, I was really struck by your earlier comment. A lot of the work when we thought about housing and systems was designed for the global south. And now it's pretty clear that in Western Europe and North America, in high-income contexts around the world, we have market failure as well. And I actually think that opportunity for linkage is an important one, because now middle-class families in high-income contexts can't afford housing. And that may actually create the opportunity for empathy in a slightly different way, hopefully, or at least understanding, because I think for so many people, they take it for granted, which is why I think housing and shelter hasn't been higher on the development priority list, not because the need wasn't there, but because I think for so many people, they've never experienced the absence of that. And so it's become a visceral issue, maybe, perhaps in a different way. I do think there are, tying these pieces together, opportunities, and it's where civil society can play a really important role, which I think that trust piece and the 4P model, which has been around for a long time, but we talk about the public-private partnerships, but so often it's actually the community level and at the city level that you can actually see real progress happen. And so often that's how do you build bridges between those community groups and the local governments, and then bring financing in a way that can start to create movement. So none of this is easy, but I think if we look at why there is so much anti-incumbency, and then we're seeing it showing up in immigration and these other themes, housing is deep at the heart of that, and it's actually cost of housing that's creating so much stress, and that's true actually in very low-income contexts and very high-income contexts.
I couldn't agree more, and I think it comes back to the point Jean made about having a shared responsibility around global challenges and seeing how we are all affected. So indeed, excellent point. Greg, just before we open up to the audience, could you perhaps just tell us a little bit about your top policy priority to improve development in urban settings?
Well, I want to go back to basics, because it's not just housing. And it's not just slum upgrading. Now, let me tell you a story about a community that we worked together with Slum Dwellers International. And it's a community up in northern Uganda. And this community's been there for 60 years. And they live in abject poverty. There's nothing there. They live in mud and corrugated iron homes. They have no running water. They have no electricity. They have a little bit of labor that comes on down the road with contractors, which it's a very, very, very poor community. Together with Slum Dwellers International, we engaged with the community, and which is one of the first lessons, that you never assume that you know the answers. But we engaged with this community about getting water and electricity into the community. We can get running water, we can get electricity into the community. And the community told us to go away. And when we then said, why? They said, you put water and electricity in this community, within 2 weeks, a big car will arrive. And out of that car will step either a minister or a big, rich, private sector man. And we will be evicted, because the value of the land will have gone up. They didn't want water and electricity, they wanted land tenure. Yeah. And they've been fighting for land tenure for decades. And because they'd been on the land for so long, their plots were, I think you could say, contiguous. You have to walk through your plot to get to your plot. And people were buried on those plots. So it now became ancestral land. And you can't get land tenure unless you have road access to every plot. And the local government had washed their hands of it. It was just too difficult. And we, together with Slum Dwellers International, worked with the community to say, well, if you give up this bit and we miss that grave, and if you give up that bit, and it's the second lesson, never underestimate the power of poor people and what they can do together as a community. Whether it be savings groups or, it's unbelievable. They got the land tenure. They did, they got it. And when we did say to them, well, now can we talk about water electricity? They went, no, we don't want your electricity, we want solar. And I think that becomes, it's really 101 of development. And sometimes it's taken decades to learn it. But never assume. So whatever we do, whatever the policies are, whatever the philosophy is, it's not just housing, it's not just slum upgrading. It's actually about people's lives, and it's about them. I've had a similar experience with taking someone from Slum Dwellers International to the Glasgow COP. And I told her that she could speak for 5 minutes, and her response was, I'll speak until I'm finished. Because this thing that you people in the global north created, and which we now suffer from, don't come and treat me as a victim now. Treat me as part of the solution, because I might have some ideas that you haven't thought of. And that was very powerful. It was one of the most powerful, again, use communities as part of the solution, whatever your priorities are.
I couldn't agree more. If it's okay with the panel, I think it's important that we open up to the audience. So I'm sure there's lots of great questions amongst you. It would be really great if you could introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from, and would really love to hear your questions. So please just pop your hand up if you've got a comment or question at all. Yes, here. Is there a mic at all? If not, I'll pass mine. Oh.
Thank you. Olivia Nielsen from Miyamoto International. So 2 questions, one for you, Jonathan, and one for you, Greg, and then I'll leave it to other people too. But I've definitely noticed that housing has become more important, and I'm super glad because I live and breathe housing with Mounia and others. And like the IMF has just developed a global housing affordability index, right? This is very new. The World Bank has made housing like I think their 3rd greatest priority. I mean, it's really come about, and I wanted to know why. Why do you think this is? That for decades it just hasn't been, on the global development landscape. And then my other question, Greg, is there like a correlation between land tenure and migration? Like if people own their land, are they less likely to move away from it? And if you know of any case studies you could tell us about. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 fantastic questions there. I think perhaps if we just take those 2, if everyone else could be thinking about your questions, and then I'll come back to you. So if we come to you first.
So I hinted at it before. I think the reason it's coming up now, sadly, is because the scale of the problem got so much worse in the last 5 years. And I think what we saw was the pandemic dramatically exacerbated what was a long-term trend. And so the gap between what it costs to create a unit of housing in almost any context right now and what the families in those communities can afford is at an historic chasm right now. And I think that's why we're hearing more about it. And it's actually becoming a political liability. If we think about Ireland, England, Canada, the US, in many, many elections around the world, cost of living, with housing being the #1 component, food being #2, is driving huge unhappiness with whoever's in office, regardless from their party. And so I do think that's made it a bigger issue. And I hope, we have the choir here, we need a much bigger choir. It's is helping people make the connections that if you don't have housing, all the other things we want don't work very well. But I do think for so many families, it's really fundamental. And it's even beyond the physical safety of a house. It's identity, it's security, there's so many aspects of home But it really starts with, I think, physical safety, economic opportunity, and goes from there. So my hope, the bad news is we have a full-out crisis, and maybe the silver lining is that's actually going to create enough will to do something about it.
So I'm not sure I have the answer for you, but I mean, I will go to one of our academic partners to say, is there research on this? Because all I can do is give you anecdotal evidence. So if you look at slum upgrading, particularly in Africa, who does that slum upgrading? Who does the informal settlement upgrading? 80% of the time it's done by the inhabitants and the community themselves, which is, I often think when governments say we're going to build houses for everybody, they're doomed to failure. You've got to create the environment and provide the tools that allow people to do that. And one of the things in that environment is land tenure. And I mean, and when I say anecdotal, I mean in my own country, in South Africa, I mean, post-apartheid, there was this whole discussion as to whether you go and you build all these houses or whether you look at actually, because then many people were living already in informality. And the more you gave people land tenure, the more likely they were to build on their property and to improve their property. Now, there are external factors that go beyond that, obviously, conflict and war and complete economic deprivation, which then still forces people. But the concept of owning your land is a very, very powerful concept. And you find, and I know from what I've seen in some of the countries where we work, that people will upgrade their slums, they're more likely to when they actually own the land.
If I can just put many years ago, a famous example, but I spent a week in Swatch outside Bogota, and it was a really good example. These were families who had escaped the narco traffickers and moved in. They'd lived for 25 years in these hillsides, but had no right to stay. And so the market never really developed. The two things the government did were made it, instead of 64 steps, we worked with them to get it down to 15 steps to get title, so families could begin to get title. And the second part was they started making transit, cable cars and bus rapid transit, so you could actually get to jobs. Those two things, they didn't build any housing, but now people could sell their house. That was a new thing. Suddenly, near the transit, people were improving housing. Stores were opening up. Retail was there. You started to see development because it made economic sense. And so I do think it is so much about creating that enabling environment that allows markets to function, and then the markets will start to move, and you'll see the activity take place.
Great, thank you. Julie et Jean, do you have anything to add on that? No? All good? Wonderful. I see a question at the back. Shall I hand you my microphone? Oh, no. Great.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the panel for all these great interventions. And my name is Sadia Khan. I work with FEDASIL, so that's the reception authority for asylum seekers in Belgium, for those who don't know. We work at the intersection of housing for asylum seekers when they enter the network. So for a little bit of context, FEDASIL works with centers, collective centers, mostly. There are other models as well, but that's the primary model, and it has come to its limits. It can't open centers endlessly. Nobody wants them in their commune, so you can imagine that we are grappling with scarcity at that point. So a number of asylum seekers do not get into the centers, and then a number of asylum seekers that have positive outcomes, so they get the status, do not get into housing. So we are really have two bottlenecks in the beginning and the end of the chain, the asylum chain. So I was wondering, learning from all this around the world, how to better integrate that asylum seekers when they have the status and can access, in theory, the housing markets, and yet they have to grapple with all these a higher threshold than the rest of us. And that's not only talking about finance, but it has also to do with their own status, and people don't want to rent out to them. So if there are any examples on that front, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Would any of the panel like to come in on that question? Thank you. Jean.
Yeah, thank you for the very good question. I think, to be honest, in Belgium and in Europe, we need to educate more, because when I hear the debate about the migration and number of refugees, the numbers we have are very small compared to what other countries in the world face. I mean, look at Syrian refugees in Lebanon or in Jordan. In Lebanon, it's 25% of the population being refugees. So here, it get me a bit angry, to be honest with you, when I hear the debate on yeah, it's difficult to integrate so many people, yet we integrated a lot of people from Ukraine and it did not pose too many issues. So it's a question of education, awareness raising, and there at Enable we have one program that we want to reinforce. It's called Be Global. It's about citizenship education from an early age, but I see an urgency, not only in Belgium, but in Europe, to explain to people that we live in a global world, and the idea that you can remain behind closed doors, it's over because of the demographics. I come back to what I said earlier. Europe will be, at the end of the century, only 300 million people. We are shrinking because we are aging. And on the other side of the Mediterranean Sea, you have potentially 4 billion inhabitants. So, the technicalities, I will let my colleagues answer, but for me, the first thing is education and awareness raising.
Thank you. Julia, did you want to come in?
Agreeing very much with what Jean said, but I wanted to give you one very interesting example we had in our project. So we developed and we worked on that in India, for example, in Bangladesh with the Harbour City University in Hamburg, where UNITAC and UN Habitat are also having some research, doing very participatory, quite digital methodology to involve communities in the question how to integrate migrants into the communities, where to build housing and so on. And when Hamburg came to the conclusion you just mentioned, so where are we going to put all the people now that they are coming, they applied this methodology developed with us for more development surroundings in Hamburg, to get really this community involvement. And I think that leads us to yes, I think in some cases we can learn also from this perspective, to see what very pragmatic also solutions, and as Jean mentioned, these communities have to find, because the numbers are much more higher in comparison with the population than they are in our case, and then to really see how these experiences can also perhaps motivate here.
Yes, sort of perhaps the city-to-city learning as well, as we were talking about earlier.
So perhaps to add to that, we have a very big program, and there are already now 400 partnerships with Ukrainian communities in there, German and Ukrainian, and there you see the same effect. Also Jean mentioned, so let's say that the responsibility that is taken also in the German communities, but also very hands-on help, where the population sees how they really can also help in these affected areas. Obviously, Ukraine is nearer, it works better. We have a lot of other partnerships that are more difficult, and how to motivate, let's say, the German side to invest in that, but the Ukrainian case is a very good one in this.
Thank you, Julia. First, Greg, and then I'll come to you, Jonathan. Thank you.
So let's go to Africa. There's a very interesting town in Africa, right in northwestern Uganda. It's called Koboko. And it's about 2 or 3 kilometers from the DRC, and about 2 or 3 kilometers from South Sudan. So they get migrants. They get lots and lots of migrants. And Erica spoke about that, a pilot, EU-funded pilot, and we worked in Koboko in that pilot, and saying, first of all, enumerate migrants and refugees. Secondly, provide services to them. And you can't provide services until you know how many people are there. And third is to look at the whole issue of social and economic integration into the fabric of the city. And it worked, because you also had a very willing mayor and a very willing local government. So the mayor of Koboko he says that, these migrants are young, they are entrepreneurs, they have energy, and he says his economy has grown 20% since he started this program. And we love taking him places, like taking him to Europe, where he walks around saying, give me more migrants, because my economy grows every time I get migrants. Now, it's not what you normally hear in Europe. So the only thing I want to say is that it's not just a European issue, it's also in Africa. There is lots of migration going on in Africa from city to city. And local government is key, and the political will is key. And he's a wonderful example. And he's just become the president of the East African Local Government Association. So he'll have influence across all the other mayors of East Africa. So it's that kind of attitude and energy that we need.
Thank you very much, Greg. To you, John.
You know, just a promising practice or maybe principle that we've experienced is to really be thoughtful about how do you create a welcome that can be sustainable. And for us, that started with the Syrian crisis, very much as you're saying. You know, there you've got Syrians arriving, lots of short-term empathy, but you've got Palestinians who've been in essentially camps that are now small cities for 75 years. And so how do you engage? And so the way we engaged in Lebanon and in Jordan was to create some small community infrastructure improvements so everyone would benefit from those, and then upgrade housing of existing families under the conditions that they would then take in a refugee family, so that there's a sense of adding value to the existing community and creating a welcoming environment. And we've done some of the same work in Eastern Europe for Ukrainian refugees to think about how do we engage in Eastern Europe with empty spaces and, you know, and create new housing, but tie it to very affordable or highly subsidized rental for some of those refugees. So there's no magic answer, but I do think if we don't create some of those mechanisms, then we start seeing over time this anti-immigrant populism that we're seeing all over now.
Absolutely, and it comes back as well to the social cohesion discussion that we were having earlier, and some of the ways that we can try to support that. Anyone else want to come in? I wasn't sure, Julia, if you were. No, brilliant. Any other questions? Yes, gentleman there.
Hi, my name's David Aubrey from UN Habitat. I head our office here in Brussels. Thank you very much for these excellent interventions. I just wanted to comment a bit on Julia's mention that the linkage to finance is sometimes tricky at the local level, particularly when we're talking about small and secondary cities, because it's difficult to get that sort of ticket size of projects that are big enough to deal with the administrative levels that's needed to organize that investment. And I just wanted to understand a little bit more about how we're dealing with this problem, because it's not just that it's difficult to get a ticket size, but often projects in cities are not traditionally, many projects in cities are not traditionally bankable. If we're talking about drainage, or if we're talking about local roads or bridges and these sort of things, it's very difficult to see a direct return on such investments, although they are critical and they're very much needed. Also, cities are often lack creditworthiness. They might not have a robust revenue system. They might not have what's needed to make them seem to be a viable partner for investment. So I just wondered if we could hear a bit more about how to unpack that problem and what sort of solutions exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent question. So challenges of investment and the need to think about cities, particularly there. Would anyone like to come in from the panel on that?
Yeah, I could perhaps start on that one. So one direction we are thinking of is to go more into pipelining and also into pooling investments of cities in order to scale that up. That could be one thing, but let's say on a more general basis, I think we have to differentiate a lot in which kind of settings we're in. So if you're in a very highly fragile setting, obviously the private sector investments will be low, and it requires stronger risk-taking from the public sector, be that MDBs or in some context, for example, for instance, in Ecuador, where we're working also with the national development banks and so on, where you really need to see how you can do risk sharing, create risk sharing mechanisms, blended finance mechanisms, and then really see how you can create an enabling environment. that said, it's not an easy task. No? And we really I'm very glad we just 2 weeks ago we got the go from our board to at GIZ to that we will invest a little bit more over the next years from our own funds to see how these mechanisms could look like, to especially address the needs. Apart from all the projects we are implementing, be that with EIB, also with World Bank, I think we really need to pay more attention to how to bridge these investment gaps, especially in higher fragile contexts where without public risk taking to a certain extent, we will not get where we need to go.
I think that really is kind of the million-dollar question in a lot of these discussions, really. How do you try to get the level of financing needed, but in a sustainable way? So yes, excellent point. Thank you, Julia. Sorry, Jean, did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. It's an excellent question. I want to come back to the point I made between the link between development organizations like us and the banks. Give you an example is Bujumbura, Burundi. Enable has been involved in the past in renovating and building new roads using a traditional methodology. It's called pavage. We use pavé. And those are still there after 10 years. So very sustainable, no need for maintenance. And we know it works basically using traditional ways and bringing a bit of innovation. Now, the government of Burundi is interested in doing another phase together with the World Bank. But the World Bank, because of the procurement rules, will say, okay, we need to procure. So who will win the contract might be a Chinese company building the road with another way of maybe less sustainable way of building. And there, I understand why it makes sense, but we need to be smarter, I think, in reducing the silos between the different institutions and sometimes revising the rules that we have to ensure that we have sustainability and consistency in the ways. In a way, the projectizations that happen in international development and the professionalization as well has some perverse effects that you have one part of the city being by one stakeholder, another part by another one, and there is no consistency between all of them. So it's at the end of the day what you said, pulling projects together to make them at scale, and I think more dialogue between the different stakeholders, and especially between the banks and NGOs and traditional actors.
Absolutely, thank you. Jonathan, did you want to come in at all on that point?
You know, I think it's been really, to me, it still comes back to de-risking, and there's de-risking at multiple levels. But how do you make it possible? I think the technology is going to help. So I think about the opportunities with as batteries are getting so much better and community-based infrastructure. I think we could do community infrastructure in very different ways than we historically did it. That may be much more cost-effective and viable. And then sometimes I think it's again going back to how do you unlock assets. So I'll give a high-income example. Still in the U.S., there are parts of lots of cities in the U.S. where there are all kinds of, they're empty houses, and the financial failure is that by the time you buy the house and fix it up and bring it up to code, it won't appraise for what you had to put into it. So we're trying to do a federal tax credit that would actually cover the gap, which would very quickly get hundreds of thousands of housing units back into action. And it's not that expensive, but it is figuring out what is that mechanism that then opens up private capital again. And so I think much harder in fragile states than in stable areas, clearly. But I think sometimes we tend to think giant infrastructure, and I think often there's small infrastructure that can still make an enormous difference.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Any final questions? Oh, yes. Oh, lots. That's great. First of all, gentleman at the back, and then I'll work my way forward.
Hello. So thank you very much for the interesting discussion. My name is Anthony Boernert-Fuchs from IHS Rotterdam. And my question will be about putting one term of the theme of the discussion in parentheses. I hope it's not beyond the focus of the discussion, but it connects very nice to the elements we have been discussing role of migrants, and it also closes a little bit the circle and connects to the first comment of Olivia, housing. I'm also coming from a housing angle. So my question is, housing is coming back to the agenda because the problem gets worse and worse, and the primary reason it's getting worse is because there's a structural mismatch between real estate appreciation, so like how prices basically increase, and the income of people. And one of the driving forces, we can't generalize in the world, is the international investments, financialization, remittances, etc. So non-local forms of finances, as housing is a very important asset to bring stability to people. People also invest. And in certain locations, this also is attracted by a lot of actors. So you have this kind of problem. So I wonder about, in your experience, as it shows a little bit that we are trying to fix a boat by tapping holes while water is coming from the top. And so I was wondering if you have practical examples that really managed a little bit to take out housing from financialization, from this kind of interest, to so the affordability is not deteriorating that rapidly. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. And if we could just take one more, because I'm aware we've got quite a few. I think there was one here. Did you want to come in? And then I'll come over to you, if that's okay. Yes, in the grey.
Hello, my name is Elias Savondier. I'm from Benin. And thank you very much. Thank you all panelists for this great and interesting discussion. I have two questions. The first one is, what are the major indicators that you use to measure the connection between international development investment and global cohesion and global stability, the major indicator that you use? And the second question is, what were your major failures when you are when we take global investment on social cohesion and global stability? So based on your experience, what were your major failures, and what were the main lessons that you have learned?
Thank you. More great questions. So I will pause it there, and then I will come back for the final round before we wrap up. So panel, any thoughts on those initial few there? Oh yes, Jean.
I can reply to the last question. It's a good one, the failures. I think the international development community has to be more honest about failures, and we don't speak enough about what works and what doesn't work. And I think in indicators, yeah, you can have, sometimes you have, and that's our problem at Enable, I think we have too many indicators, and we try to measure, again, project by project, whether we succeed or not. And sometimes we should look back over the history, over the last 10 years, what really worked and what didn't work. And for that, you need to go beyond a project life cycle, but to go through a long-term perspective. The problem is that the donor community is not ready for that. And I come back to my first point about the public opinion. If you say to the public opinion in Belgium that gives taxpayer money for international development, look, we invested there and we failed, people will say, but then we don't do it anymore. And for me, the success of a housing, let's say, project, of a local economic development project, of an urbanization project in Burkina Faso should not be measured differently, or in Benin, from a project in Brussels. And that's the mistake the international development community has done, is to create a complete new set of indicators for project in the south without actually using the one we use here in Belgium, because in Belgium we fail as well. When you are the mayor of a city and you try to redevelop a less well-off area of your own town, it's not always working. And you look at Brussels, we have areas of Brussels that are underdeveloped for many years. Look at the number of people not having any housing here in Brussels is huge. So again, not making a difference between what we do here and what we do in the south. For me, the first reason of failure is governance. If you don't have a strong appetite from a mayor of local authority and a real desire to make the difference, I think we shouldn't do the project. And that's sometimes difficult to assess and difficult to say. And I think, I say to my team many times, sometimes we should stop a project. If you start on good grounds, because you have a goodwill from the local authorities, but then there is a change, and you have people who don't really care, I think we should stop. It's difficult because people are on the ground, people are working on the project, sometimes they have a short-term contracts linked to the project. But we should do, if we want, again, I come back to my first point, get the interest of our politicians on what we do, we really need to be more honest about what works and what doesn't work.
Thanks, Jean. Julia, did you want to come in?
Yeah. What we are trying to do, and that goes very much in the same direction, is really to see we have some standard indicators where we try to look at our engagement worldwide in these issues and say what are our impacts there. It's quite complicated, and I come to back to the point of the, let's say, very context-specific approaches we're trying to have. But I also very much agree, and if I would have to talk about the failures, I would say, I think in international development cooperation for many years, and I'm happy that it didn't start yesterday, that it has changed, but for many years we looked at development like from a very technical perspective and ignoring that this is a highly political topic. And that the environments where we are working in are political systems that are very complex and that we have to deal with that. So recognizing this leads us to a debate since many years of how do we approach this? No? How do we get better in our political economy analysis of the context? How do we get the sufficient flexibility to adapt to this kind of context and so on? And especially in fragile contexts, this is crucial because also the environments are changing very quickly. So I think really to recognize and to inhale, let's say, the fact that that's our political processes in our partner countries, that we will not solely from a foreign perspective change completely, but that we really can support, let's say, positive developments that are taking on the ground, catalyze them, let's say, and lead to development. I think that's a very important point in this.
Thank you, Julia. Yes, Jonathan.
I was going to go back to the first question, and way oversimplified, but I think structurally, if you look at the last 5 years, it was a perfect storm that interrupted supply at a time when we're undersupplied. So every one of these cities, if the great megatrends are rapid urbanization and climate change, don't have the infrastructure or the housing for the populations they had 10 years ago, let alone the growth they've experienced. And yet a lot of subsidy went to the demand side, not the supply side. So we subsidize individuals, but if you don't have enough supply of housing, and interest rates are so low, you got private capital buying up real estate and people bidding up real estate. So it just drove prices up much faster than inflation, when what we desperately need is actually supply. So to me, I'm consumed with how do you actually grow supply of housing at a level that's commensurate with the scale of need, because otherwise we're seeing people just bidding it up. The other principle, I think, is potentially separating land from the building, because actually the cost of land has gone up even faster, though materials and everything else has gone up. And I think there are a lot of creative mechanisms and context-specific about how you subsidize sort of lasting affordability in the land, and then people can still trade and own the physical assets sitting on it. But if they don't own the land underneath it, that changes the affordability gap quite significantly.
Thank you very much. And finally, Greg.
So just on the issue of failures, I mean, one example that I think Cities Alliance have in my staff will know which country I'm talking about. It was around solid waste management. And it was pretty much where there were 3 role players. And Cities Alliance would do its piece, and then another funder or another agency would do another piece, and a third stakeholder would do another piece. And it's almost a sense that doesn't always work. Because when you do your piece and you throw it over the wall to the next one, as opposed to one much more integrated approach across 3 different intermediaries. The second part on this is I think we also need to be bold enough to sometimes say to a donor, and a government donor, this is not going to work. Because very often the donor provides money based on what they think the priorities are. These are their own priorities. So when USAID started talking to us about Haiti, and they wanted to strengthen local government, and they originally, in the original discussions, it was about going to local government and talk to local government and look at their finance systems. And our response initially was, you're wasting your money, because there's no trust with the community. So go into the community first and slowly build it up and then bring local government in. And to USAID's credit, they turned around and said, everything else we've done has failed, maybe your way's better. And we have this learn and adapt on an annual basis. Unfortunately, last week's events overtook us on USAID and Haiti. Just on the first comment, so the issue around, yes, I mean, affordability in housing is one mismatch. But often in the Global South, the mismatch is around appropriate land and housing. So what happens is that in the lack of proper urban expansion planning, you just get sprawl. And one of my favorite cities in the world, and the first time I ever went there, I was a lot younger than I am now. And it was Lusaka. And I thought, I could live here. It's just such a wonderful place. It's got 2 shopping malls that are small, and the roads work, and the people are nice. You go to Lusaka now, it's just this sprawl that is how not to do urban development. And just lack of urban expansion planning. And so that's what we need, because that's in the Global South, that's a bigger mismatch than affordability and
Thank you very much. Very important point. I know there's some people final round of questions, so if I could go over here first, and then we will be wrapping up, and finally over here. Thank you.
Yes, hello. Armelle Guillemard from DG-INTPA. As we are exploring the connection between international development investment, social cohesion, and global stability, I would like to have your point of view on the role of the diaspora right now in Europe. And I think it can be a very positive way also to support local development investment, because they put a lot of money, and we are now on the third or generation. Now they are Europeans, and they are still part of this global connections between us and the Global South, as we say. And they don't only put investment, but they are also now elected representatives from our cities, and they can be bridges also to support a new type of local governance, local democracy, local participation, because they still have this link with their families, their representatives in their country. So I think it can be also can be useful to hear about how you work with them and how we should support also, which is not only, they're not anymore diaspora for some of them. There are Belgians, there are Germans, there are whoever, European citizens, but still in connections with these countries and at local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And final question over here. Yes, do you mind? If not, I'll hand. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sarah Maaddi. I'm a Palestinian refugee in Jordan. Actually, I have 2 questions, if I can take it.
Of course.
One is, in general, I'm an architect, and I always wonder if I want to work in like developing countries with areas that build with natural building materials, and like it's different for me when I went to last year I went to Africa, like Zanzibar, and I noticed that there's many communities that they love what they actually, the way they live, but as an external eye, I thought, and as an architect, should I, if I want to do a project there, should it be aligned with what they want, like what they are used to, building with natural earth material, creating some community spaces that are small, that this is what they are used to, or should we just introduce new elements, new materials, a new way of building, new functions? What is the best thing? Should we just accept what they are used to live with, or should we introduce new things to them? My second one, it's more about my people in Gaza. As an architect, directly after the war stopped, I wanted to do something for them. And I started like contacting NGOs, or how can I help, or what's the best thing I can do for them. But it came to my mind that how these NGOs or organizations will start rebuilding Gaza, especially that many people there, they are refusing to leave their countries. What's the steps as an urban planners, as investors, what's the steps they are going to go through to rebuild it? Where the displaced people will go? What will they focus on first? Is it the housing? Is it the markets? Is it the transportation system? That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. So wrapping up there, three very big questions. Would you like to come in? Jean, can I come to you first?
Yes, I can quickly reply for the last question. Actually, we are involved in Able together with RAND Corporation in thinking about kind of urban planning for Gaza. So my team is here. Alexi is part of this. So if you want to engage, you can. The key thing is coordination, because many different organizations will want to do something in Gaza. And the question we ask ourselves is, who is the lead and how to plan? But we need to plan. The risk is that people go back to Gaza, to their former house, and then there is no master plan to relocate communities and no opportunity to do things better. And that's linked to your first question. Indeed, cultural differences need to be taken into account, but that's why I love international cooperation, is when you can bring the best of people together and have a peer or emulation between the people. So of course you need to respect local traditions and not impose any new standard, but if you can improve the local tradition by bringing new techniques, is what we have done in Uganda, for example, on vocational training. We've built vocational training institutions using local materials, but bringing new climate adaptive technologies or construction techniques that help to make the buildings more efficient. And that's the beauty of international cooperation. On the first question on diaspora, very good point. There is an initiative here in Brussels called the Brussels Africa Hub, and their idea is to pool remittance together, because as you mentioned, there are people giving remittance to Africa, but that have a lot of money and that do not want to do anymore only to their families or to their communities, but would like to invest in more systematic projects. And that's where we need to be innovative, and I'm very happy we have a new government in Belgium since yesterday, but in the government note, they ask us to look at innovative ways of linking the diaspora, it's not mentioned diaspora, but new ways of financing projects with traditional one. And there is an obvious link. It's a huge amount of money, the diaspora, and more I hear people, associations, professional associations as well. Last time I met a dentist from the diaspora saying, I want to invest in dentist structures in my home country, but I don't want to do just one. I want to do something more structural. How can we work together? And that's what we need to think about as INTPA as well, how you can structure that. Very good question.
Excellent point. Thank you. Julia, can I come to you?
Yeah. I will leave out the architect's question about materials. I think there are others on the panel that can better ask. As for Gaza, I can't tell you if there's a master plan for Gaza, but I can tell you what we did in Mosul. And I think that this leads us again to the learning point, no? to see what was successful in other regions. So we've been implementing for many years the recovery and rehabilitation program in Mosul, and they're focusing on, let's say, a combination of restoring essential services, education and health, with improving livelihood. For example, starting with very short-term, let's say, like cash for work measures for the population, but also combining this with vocational training, and then also fostering social cohesion measures with the communities, no? And this combination has been quite successful. I could give you all the numbers, but perhaps we could talk in the break. So this focusing on, let's say, the critical infrastructure that needs to be restored has been a very good approach there. To the diaspora, I think you're absolutely right with the point you made. One thing is remittances, but we are also seeing in many of the city-to-city partnerships how people from the countries are playing a very crucial and a very motivating role, no, in really making this city-to-city partnerships sustainable, in really establishing the context in the first place in many cases. And I think we need to take a look at this closely. What we have is like a diaspora fund where also diaspora communities can get funds for specific projects they want to make in their home countries or former home countries, if they are already Germans. And this is going on for many years with very excellent results, no? Because it's like from people to people, no? And this always has a certain impact. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. And Greg, finally.
So I may step on some toes by saying this, but after the Haiti, and it's about the Gaza question, so after the Haiti earthquake, everybody and their dog went to Haiti. Yeah. It is the worst example of international development in the history of development. There was no trickle down. The money stayed revolving around the international NGOs and the donors, and 10 years later there were still people living in tents. Let's not do that again in Gaza. Mm-hmm. So, at the World Urban Forum, some of us had the opportunity of engaging with a small group of Gaza mayors. Where do you want to go? Go to the mayors first. They're the local leaders. They know their communities. They know the community needs. Go to the mayors. That would be my advice. On the issue of like in Zanzibar and in the heritage practices, yes, we need to preserve heritage practices, but at the same time we need to start introducing issues of climate-resilient materials in building. We have to. But we've got to take the community with us on that journey while respecting heritage. And heritage itself can help promote issues around climate resilience. And that's another whole discussion. On remittances, on diaspora, you see I'm jumping. On diaspora, it's remittances. Remittances is extensive. And I think we underestimate it. We were having a discussion internally in Cities Alliance the other day that just the deportation of Mexicans and Haitians from the USA, that the effect it can have on the Mexican and Haitian economy, we completely underestimate the size of those remittances and if you take them away, economies suffer.
Thanks so much, Greg. Finally,
yeah, I'll try,
Jonathan.
Just to be quick, just to build on that quickly. remittances are a huge source of housing, and they're inefficiently spent. So one of the things we have not succeeded in figuring out is how do we actually make the remittances more efficient so that the families getting them get more value for money in terms of, and I think there's some really interesting ideas on how to do that, but it's hard to organize it because people tend to be very specific about helping their family and their extended family. But I think it's a big idea. On appropriate technology, my experience is exactly right, that you have to introduce it slowly, and I have so many architects bringing totally inappropriate, space age ideas that don't look, would make no sense in local context. And I think the key is how do you bring them along. One thing we found really helpful is build a small community building, a clinic or a school or something out of the new material. Let everyone see it for a year plus, see that it does well in different environments, and then they might adopt it. I mean, one of the simplest ones for us has been soil stabilized blocks in rural areas. Super low cost, incredibly environmentally friendly, can be made locally, and with the right chemistry are attractive and really long lasting. So it's sort of finding what are those technologies that work better, or sometimes incredibly basic. I mean, the value of a cement floor instead of a dirt floor has the massive value in terms of health of the family.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion. We've covered everything from development and, round of applause straight away. Julia, Greg, Jonathan and Jean, thank you so much. Thank you for the incredibly insightful questions, which I really enjoyed. I think we had a really good, engaging discussion, and I'm really looking forward to talking more during the lunch break. Thank you again for the invitation to speak, and I will hand back to you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dora. Thank you, all the panelists, for an amazing discussion. This has been very rich and dense already. There are so many keys to apprehend and understand international development in the context of fragile urban contexts moving forward. I will just mention very briefly a few of those. One is to move from provide to enable, from having short-term impact to building structural long-term change. Another one is to embrace informality, as this is something we have to work with in many fragile contexts. Another one is partnerships on so many levels, partnering with the local communities, working with the mayors, working on so many different levels with whomever is willing and able to support change. There is an immense opportunity to leapfrog in fragile urban contexts. Flexibility is key to understanding changing environments and moving in changing environments. Technology, Jonathan reminded us of the importance of technology and to use it as a leverage. And finally, to be bold, brave, and humble to also talk about what doesn't work, as it can serve our future projects as an organization, but it can serve everybody else when we're able to look at that. Thank you very much. We will have lunch just outside of this room where we had the welcome coffee this morning, and we will reconvene at 1:30 in this room. Thank you very much. Thank you again, Cities Alliance and Habitat for Humanity.